Welcome to the 9th South Forum on Sustainability. Today we're honored to invite Professor Beverly Silver to give a lecture on the crisis of global capitalism and the nexus of domestic and international conflict. Beverly Silver is a professor in the Department of Sociology and director of the Arrighi Centre for Global Studies, Johns Hopkins University. Her research focuses on problems of development, labor, social conflict, and war using comparative and world historical methods of analysis. Professor Silver, the floor is yours.
Thank the organizers for the invitation and also for putting together this really excellent lineup of discussions spreading out over the month on very important topic at a critical moment in time for humanity. I wanted to begin by picking up on a couple of points that were raised in the first 2 days of the South-South Forum. And one was raised yesterday by Professor Tiejun in terms of the nature of the deep crisis of capitalism in US world power. And one thing he brought up, and which I agree with, is the role of the unsustainable level of United States debt as a key aspect of the crisis, and particularly the amount of debt owed to Japan and China. The debt cannot be paid back without provoking a major collapse in US living standards, similar to the kind of collapse that third world countries were forced to endure under US and IMF imposed structural adjustment policies over the last 4 decades. And a current important aspect of how the current crisis is likely to unfold is the is the efforts by the United States to avoid paying back this debt. And Professor Wen yesterday referred to the possibility, the relationship between debt and warfare, and particularly I think his point, although I may have missed the full nature of the point, but was that debt leads to warfare as a sort of form of attempting to get out of paying debts, but also the accumulation of debt is related to borrowing for militarism and warfare. And so it's a two-way relationship between the accumulation of debt and the militarism and warfare. And so I think it's one of, like, when we're thinking about how to confront the current crisis and how to avoid a complete disaster for humanity, one of the questions is going to be how to think about and disentangle this relationship between debt and war, and the possibility of provoking geopolitical or increasing geopolitical tensions as an excuse not to pay back debts, particularly in relation to the debt owed to China, the treasury bond debts owed to China. So this is one, the background paper that I sent, and I'll arrange for the organizers to put it on the South-South Forum website, along with a couple other papers, but was emphasizing the role of the way in which the United States is coming to play an increasingly dysfunctional role in the world, because it's not willing to accept a more equitable distribution of world power. So this clinging to number one status is leading the United States to play an increasingly dysfunctional role in the world. In 1999, in Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System, Giovanni Arrighi and I and others wrote about the importance of avoiding a slide into systemic chaos. So this is like 23 years ago when Chaos and Governance was published, and argued that, you know, there were two important prerequisites to avoiding a long, deep slide into systemic chaos and intense human suffering. And one was that the US and the declining Western powers accept a more equitable distribution of wealth and power in the world. And the other is that, that new forms of organization of life and livelihood be found that move beyond, that overcome, that are a substitute for the highly ecologically destructive and unequal basis of organization of life under Western capitalism over the last 5 centuries. So unfortunately, in 23 years, these both of these, the US has not adjusted more to a more equal distribution of world power on the one hand, and the other hand, the challenges for a new order, a new system, or a more a sustainable organization of world society. These challenges has become more obvious, but also again, there are experiments here and there, but the significant progress is still awaiting. Professor Muto Ichio, on the first day of the South-South Forum, spoke about the importance of renewing a vision of social justice as an essential prerequisite for finding solutions to the challenges facing us in the 21st century. And so, again, not suggesting a return to the 20th century visions around social justice, but saying that there was a program of social justice in the 20th century, and we need to have something really articulated, central, and forward in the 21st century. I think this is also a key point, and something, you know, to be discussed. Certainly the project of, or the proposal for ecological civilization put forward by Professor Wen Tiejun and others is quite in the direction that we need to go. And I'll come back to all these. I'll come back in the course of my talk to different aspects of things that I've raised now, but I just wanted to start by linking back to issues that have already come up in the first 2 days. So the main argument in the paper that I shared with the discussants and that I will post, I'm only going to talk about that, I think, for about 10 minutes, because I also want to move on to other things. But the main argument there is that if we look over the period from the end of the Second World War to the present, there is a transition in the US foreign policy from a situation in which it was arguably playing the role of legitimate protection vis-a-vis its allies, not vis-a-vis the other part of the world, you know, but vis-a-vis its class and state allies, was playing a role of legitimate protection by providing cheap military protection against dangers that it had not itself created. But starting in around Vietnam War and after that, increasingly the US came to be play a role, the move from a regime of legitimate protection to something that we could call the protection racket. So something kind of, and the word protection racket is an analogy to the kind of role played by mafia bosses or gangsters, where they both create the danger and offer to provide protection from the danger at a price. Okay, so that as we get into the 1980s and beyond, increasingly, the United States is no longer offering free protection to its allies, but charging for protection. And it's also, at the same time, creating a lot of the dangers that its allies need protection from. So if we go from, Bush Sr. Got enormous contributions from allied countries to fight the first Gulf War. And by the time of Bush Jr., we go from cash contributions from allies to debt financing. And the debt financing of US military activities and wars has become the main way of supporting US militarism abroad, and with China and Japan being the main holders of treasury bonds. I want to, so this, just gets back to setting up some of the dynamics around debt and militarism and war. But I wanted to spend a bit of time today talking about the relationship between this debt and international conflict and war and militarism and domestic conflict. Because the emergence over the last 4 decades of this highly dysfunctional military protection regime has gone hand in hand with the emergence of a highly dysfunctional social protection regime. So that, as the military, US military regime was transformed, also went hand in hand at the same time with the emergence of austerity politics, neoliberalism, the decline of the welfare state, and the move from the developmentalist project to the Washington consensus around around neoliberal policies is the key thing to follow. So the result has been, and I think now I'm going to share my screen in a minute, is that we've had a move over the last 40 years towards growing inequality, which we all know in most countries in the world, with some exceptions, or some, well, probably no exceptions, but some backward movements, some containment in some places, and growing, in a sense, we've gone from what was a crisis of profitability for capitalism in the 1970s to a crisis of legitimacy for capitalism by the crisis of 2008. So that, that basically wages were squeezed, working conditions squeezed, it was cheap labor regime. And by 2008, after the crisis of 2008, we start to see growing social protest, which I would argue is one of the outcomes of this deep crisis of legitimacy. So I hope everyone can see this slide. This is from a project, a collective research working group project at the Arrighi Centre for Global Studies. And it's based on the international reporting of social protest events from the New York Times and the Guardian. And it excludes the reporting on US protest events from the New York Times, and it excludes United Kingdom protest events from The Guardian. But I've got the pictures over on the right side. Hopefully people can see the right side of the graph. That there are two things that I wanted to start by pointing out, and that is that after the fall, well, in the 90s, in the first decade of the 21st century, or one could say that it's not coincidentally after the fall of the Soviet Union, that there's 2 decades of historically low levels of social protests being reported. And then after 2008, we get a significant uptick from 2 decades of fairly low reported social conflict to a significantly high levels of social conflict in the decade after the 2008 crisis. And this is like happening in many countries. You know, I think that this is something that shows up in the data we collected on with the newspaper reports, but it's also something that everyone was somewhat aware of. You know, in 2011, Time magazine made the protester the person of the year, and 2000 again. So, and if we're in the process of updating the data, but I think as we update the data, we're going to see that this is not just a little temporary increase around 2011, 2014, but that it's continued to increase over the last 6 years. It's a moving average, so it, you know, anyway. So this is one thing that I wanted to show, is to say that we're in a period of rising social protest, social unrest. If I could show you the chart of the number of countries, and again, there's a big increase in the number of countries that are where there are reports of social protest, social unrest. So it's this peak in the last decade. It's not being produced by just 1 or 2 countries. It's a widespread phenomena of this major growth of social protest. And this gets me back a little bit to some of the things we started out at the beginning, because when we were talking about the relationship between debt and war, there's also a historical relationship between major waves of social protest and war. And some of it has to do with the temptation of governments to deflect from internal conflict by promoting external enemies. You know, it could be internal enemies, you know, like immigrants, or it could be external enemies like enemy countries. And so there's not only we have lots of things that make us concerned about the potential for war, but managing this relationship between social conflict and war is also important. Now, I'm going to, let me give a little bit of a historical discussion, and then I'll go back to something. So this is the same chart you've just been looking at, but it's annotated. I think one of the ways that I and others, and particularly people working in a world systems perspective, tend to think of the present as a period of crisis of United States world hegemony, or a crisis and breakdown of the long 20th century, which was one in which the US had a major role in forming the international order. The first half of the 20th century was the period of terminal crisis and breakdown of British world hegemony. And what I've done by annotating the picture of world social protest in this way is to point to the fact that in the last period of breakdown of world hegemony in the first half of the 20th century, We also had a period of rising, a trend of rising social protest interspersed with the world wars. So these, I just put Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution there, but it's, you know, there's many revolutions and such going on at that time. So then if you look to the right side of the chart, what of the time series here, there's the arrow going up and the question mark. So if we're thinking that we're in a period that has analogies, not identical, but analogies with the first half of the 20th century, then we have reason to believe that this period of terminal crisis breakdown of US world hegemony that we're in now is going to be associated with also with rising social protest and social conflict. So this is, and then there's, again, some of this theoretically relates back to some arguments we made in Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System, which I won't go into now. But what I wanted to say, you know, because here's, I wanted to take a minute to say why social protest is a good thing and why it's also needs, it can be reacted to by states in very bad ways. And so it requires the movements and those of us who are trying to think about how to shorten or get out of this period of systemic chaos and move to something more, a more equitable and just world society, that we have to think about this relationship between war and social protest, as well as thinking about the relationship between war and debt and, you know, other things. So, the social protest, it's a good thing because it's a sign that people are refusing to accept extreme inequality. It's a sign that people are refusing to accept the destruction of the planet. So a lot of the social protest is climate change protest. It's a good thing because it's a sign that people are protesting against and refusing to accept intolerable working conditions. A lot of this is labor unrest and asking for decent wages and dignified livelihood and social conditions. And a lot of it is anti-war protest, and it's a protest, again, that people are refusing to accept growing militarism and warfare and for moving for peace. But it also is a sign what we have. If capitalists and states were willing and able to respond to these demands from below by offering real change, then we have a smooth transition and we're in great shape. But capitalists and states are tempted to find external enemies to divert the internal conflict. And so as it happened, you know, on the eve of, in the decades leading up to the First World War, there were many cases of governments, European governments, who thought that, you know, a short little war would increase their popularity. And in particularly Russia, you end up with major, if it's miscalculations and revolutions and what have you. So, so I'm going to show, let's see how we're doing on time. We're okay. Let me show, I'm sorry. Again, I don't know if people can see this, how well people can see this, but this is a chart that pictures the crises of the long 20th century. And one way to think about the situation we're in, and this is published, and I can stick the link into the chat later, maybe, but is, one way to think about capitalism is as a system that has a tension between profitability and legitimacy. So the profitability crises get resolved by squeezing labor, increasing, extraction, increasing exploitation of nature and of human beings. And that may resolve the crisis of profitability, but it creates a growing crisis of legitimacy for capitalism, right? And then the crises of legitimacy are solved, can potentially be solved. They can be solved, but they solved at the expense of capital. So there's an ongoing tension between crisis of profitability and crisis of legitimacy. And you can see it at all sorts of different scales, geographical scales, within countries, between, but this is a broad macro kind of swing of over the long 20th century, showing this kind of swings back between where exploitation of fictitious commodities is too high and exploitation is too low from the point of view of capital, and how that overlaps with hegemonic crises. So it's a little bit busy, the chart, but let me just say that where we are is crisis number 4, which is at the very top of the table, where it's a deep crisis of legitimacy for capitalism. And, I would have thought, in fact, I did think when I first did this chart in, I think, 2008. And when I first made this chart in 2008, I thought we would already be seeing, including for the United States, I think China actually has moved a little bit back to the right side of the arrow in terms of trying to minimize inequality, lessen the level of inequality, but certainly in the United States and Europe, if anything, if you look at this last arrow, that was leading up to 2008 crisis, that if anything, we've gone somehow further in this direction, right, toward increased inequality. And so then, and then that's part of the, okay. So I wanted to just end by actually reading a little bit from the last section of the paper that I shared. And that section is called The Nexus of Social and Geopolitical Conflict. And some of it will refer back to things that I've already said, and some of it will be new things. But so the US, the post-war United States global regime stood on 2 pillars, one in the military and geopolitical sphere, and one in the social and economic sphere. And over the past 4 decades, both of these pillars have crumbled. A vicious circle has ensued whereby the insecurities produced by a dysfunctional US regime of military protection and the insecurities produced by a dysfunctional regime of social protection have fed into each other, resulting in a slide into systemic chaos on a global scale. Reversing the ongoing slide into systemic chaos requires a radical reimagination of what we might call legitimate protection or social protection for the 21st century, one that provides a credible solution to the deep social and ecological problems left behind by 6 centuries of capitalism and Western domination of the world system. In the geopolitical sphere, a new global regime of legitimate protection would have to reflect the changing balance of power between East and West and global North and South. That is, the fact that 5 centuries of Western military and financial domination of the capitalist world system has come to an end. Indeed, any regime of protection that does not factor in this world historical shift in the balance of power into its foundations will be neither global nor legitimate. A second point in terms of the radical rethinking is on the ecologically unsustainable nature of industrial capitalism. And here I don't think I need to elaborate. A third is in the socioeconomic sphere, where a simple return to Keynesian welfare state compacts is not possible, as there were two kind of limitations. One is that the high levels of welfare provided and wages provided to workers in the global north were dependent on the exclusion of the majority of the world's populations. That profitability and the legitimacy obtained through high wages could only go together if a big part of the world's population were excluded. So again, this is like the question of this tension between profitability and exclusion. I'm sorry, profitability and legitimacy. You could potentially provide legitimate wages and welfare conditions under capitalism that create a stable social compact, but going hand in hand with profitability means excluding the majority of the world's population. Finally, the US regime of social protection was intimately tied with militarism. It was based on massive military expenditures, military Keynesianism, and a close connection between advances in workers' rights and warfare. The welfare state and the warfare state developed in symbiotic relation to each other. In retrospect, the relatively stable Cold War duopoly of power, sorry, let me just skip that. So I'll save the translators a little bit of dealing with this. Okay. Historically, in periods of crisis, and this is the point about the relationship between social conflict and war, historically in periods of crisis, ruling groups have been tempted to divert attention from their own failings by seeking scapegoats, internal and external, around which to build national chauvinistic cross-class alliances. Rulers had learned, at least in the short run, that little victorious wars could produce a rally around the flag effect and bolster governments. The Spanish-American War for the United States and the South African War for the United Kingdom were two such examples from the late 19th century. Likewise, just before the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, the Russian Interior Minister remarked that, quote, "This country needs a short, victorious war to stem the tide of revolutions." Examples of such diversionary wars abound in the historical record, such that the presumed nexus of civil conflict and international conflict has become one of the most venerable hypotheses in the social science literature. So in the social science literature, the idea that there's the scapegoat hypotheses as far as wars is common. I'm going to skip some of this. The problem was that these kind of efforts to tamp down social conflict through war were counterproductive, and the brutality of war was just as likely to spark an escalation in conflict. So the fact that we have the Russian Revolution in the middle of the First World War is not a coincidence. So likewise today, in the context of mounting social unrest worldwide and a deepening crisis of world hegemony, there's a temptation for ruling groups to find scapegoats and to involve themselves in what they think might be short and popular wars. And a lot of what's going on in relationship, but a lot of what I see is happening in the relationship and how the United States is behaving toward China has to do, in part with there are these three different things I think that we need to disentangle: the debt, the almost cultural attachment to the idea of remaining number one, and then this politics using external enemies as a basis for internal social cohesion. And I kind of disentangling these three things. So we're in a situation where there's this big powder keg of explosive material. And then you have ruling groups, especially within the United States, but not only, playing with matches sitting on top of the powder keg. And so if we finish with this analogy, then we have two problems. One is to get the explosive material out of the powder keg, and that is bringing about structural transformations that address the root causes of the crisis. And again, this question of this proposal of move toward ecological civilization is one of the proposals out there that is attempting to address the structural roots of the crisis. And the second is to take the matches away from those in power. And taking the matches away from those in power, because those in power appear to be willing to be willing to take the risk of blowing up the entire world in an effort to retain their own wealth and power. So this means a widespread shift, an accommodation to a changing balance of world power on the part of the West. And it means a resistance on the part of people everywhere to efforts to create cross-class pro-war mobilization, right? So to end, I'll just paraphrase E.H. Carr, who wrote a book just after the Second World War called Nationalism and After. And he commented that on the eve of the First World War, ruling classes convinced the mass of European workers that their bread was buttered on the side of national belligerence rather than on the side of internationalist unity. Today, we can't afford to make the same mistake. The costs of making the same mistake are unfathomable to imagine in terms of the cost to humanity and human beings. So that's where I'll end. I was worried that I would take too long, but I didn't take too long. So, but that gives us time for discussion, and also for, since we started an hour later for people in China, we won't keep you till after midnight. Thank you.
谢谢 Silver 教授。
Thank you, Professor Silver, for saving us at least 5 to 15 minutes. And it is also my hope that our discussion today will be brief and to the point. We have not seen each other for like 2 or 3 years due to this pandemics. In the past, almost every year we have the opportunity to meet and have exchanges in person. This time, I believe her speech is quite different from the past, is that she talked about the contemporary pressing threat of imperialism, war caused by this, and compare this with war caused by economic crisis and the shift of power. These two closely combined, and in addition, she also added the element of social protest and its relation with revolution. this angle is very pluralistic, and the frame is also very complex, which gave us a very big picture so that they can have a better view to look through, see through history and understand how human beings in the evolution of the capitalist society, how they experience the different kinds of contradictions and conflicts like warfare, hunger, and economic and political crisis. All these complex phenomena behind this, there always has to be law or norms. I think her speech really amazed me to a great degree. This kind of narrative and multi-angle of narrative of perception is not very common, at least in China. So it is also my hope that the organizers of this forum can play a bigger role to help us with Professor Silver's speech so that this multi-angle meta history analysis and our to combine this with our discussion of evolution of crisis. Maybe we want to set up a group of crisis analysis. This group of crisis analysis will objectively try to distill from experience the laws and norms that are worthy. We want to turn these laws and norms into theological instruments, theological tools, so that when they are faced with complex situations, they can handle them better. Well, one thing I would like to mention is that currently in the US, the major social contradiction, if we analyze this with the fundamental theory of Marxism, is that the superstructure is too much far away from its fundamental structure. Especially, it goes back to the old Cold War in terms of economics. Although I talked about the new Cold War yesterday, but the instruments or the weapons they used were from the arsenal of the old Cold War. And this makes us feel that the US, their politicians, they do not have enough theoretical tools. Back then, when the 9/11, September 11 events strike, that time that the Bush administration brought about the concept of crusade. The crusade is a very ancient concept of the ancient European feudalism. It is used by Bush to interpret the conflict between the US and extreme Islamists. He used this term, this crusade term. And this makes a large number of non-Western, especially global South countries, that made them not stand with the US, because this crusade is a kind of conflict described by Huntington's theories. As the US was fighting extremism and terrorism, their theoretical tools are very out of date. When they had that Wall Street financial tsunami, the US tried to shift out the inflation throughout the world, which made PPI increase a great deal, which turned into the CPI of the global South developing countries. At that time, the US did not make any powerful or convincing explanation, as the US is facing deepening crisis, its understanding of the problems, not only as Professor Silver mentioned, they cannot find the problem from within, find the reason from find the cause from within, to how it, and even blame China, which helped it to crack down on its inflation, and designated China as the arch enemy. And this, the growth of PPI shifting to CPI is happening in the US. This is a general norm, a law. The US denied this law and used the Cold War tool, and by believing that the problems in the West are caused by communism or by socialism. This tool is way too outdated. It cannot explain all the contradictions occurring in the world today. So I believe the crisis and its evolution today are extremely varying, increasingly varying. That there is the probability that it turn into war is because there's no theoretical tools from the US to turn something into policy. And when they try to shift costs, they have inflation in the US. In China, they can explain this quite well, but their mainstream politicians cannot explain this. We see that this alliance of new Cold War led the politicians of other Western countries to form a new alliance. And this new alliances of new Cold War, they use the theoretical tool that cannot explain the crisis or the dilemma or the difficulties they are in. And they have to blame opposing states. And this explanation or interpretation are generally not accepted around the world. So as I said, why they need to set up this international group of crisis analysis is because they want more meta-history narrative, meta-history analysis, perception, so that we can, from a more comprehensive or overall perspective, to see these big crises, and the ideological tools used by the US are very absurd and out of date. A clear understanding of these can benefit the majority of countries, even the countries of the global north. So this is so much for my response, and it is our hope that our following two discussants may provide more explanation or interpretation and go to greater details in terms of analysis.
Thank you.
Our first discussant is Gabriel MERINO. He is a PhD in social sciences. He is Associate Researcher of National Council for Scientific and Technological Research, with a workplace in Institute of Research in Humanities and Social Sciences of the National University of La Plata, Associate Professor at UNLP, and invited Associate Professor at the National University of Mar de la Plata, coordinator of the COSO Work Group China and the Map of World Power, Director of the Research and Development Project, the South Atlantic and its relations with other regions of global geopolitical section, member of the Institute of International Relations. Please, Professor MERINO, please come and make your comments. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure listening again, Beverly Silver. A magnificent presentation. Thank you, Beverly. Well, first, I think that the theoretical and methodological perspective of Arrighi and Silver is a great tool to understand the current transition of power, the structural roots of the crisis of hegemony, this systemic chaos. I want to underline this point. Second, for me, it's important to say that in Latin America now there is a emergency of a second progressive or national popular wave in the region, which is yet to be defined if it ends up being born or not, but it reflects an important question. The problem is that the application of a project of peripheral neoliberalism in a stage or hyper-financialization quickly produces a profound political and social crisis. And we can see that in the recent years. This second political progressive or national popular wave is in relation to an increase, a huge increase of social protests and movements against neoliberalism, specifically a peripheral neoliberalism. To understand this question, it's important to take the concept of crisis of hegemony of Arrighi and Silver perspective. They say, when we have a crisis of hegemony, when the hegemonic state lacks the means or the will to continue leading the system of a state in a direction that is widely perceived as expanding, not just its power, but the collective power of the system dominant groups. This is our first important point. And we can see in the global south since 2000 or 1999, 2001, a problem for the dominant groups of these peripheral and semi-peripheral countries to accept the hegemony of the United States. And on the other hand, you have a problem with subordinate groups and classes. The social protests and the movements since 1999, since 2001, and you can see in Latin America a wave of protests in these years. It's an expression of this problem to dominant groups to lead the system. In 1999, 2001, it's the beginning of the geopolitical reaction against unipolar movements, the neoliberal order, and the US hegemony. First, it's a wave of crisis between 1997 and 2001, a process of global process of accumulation by dispossession, deepening of neoliberalism, and acceleration of denationalization of states. And you have, in this moment, a wave of crisis in Latin America and reaction against neoliberalism. For example, crisis in Brazil, 1999, and the emergence of Lula da Silva and the government of el Partido de los Trabajadores, working party, in 2002. The crisis in Argentina between 1999 and 2001, and reaction and the emergence of the Kirchnerism, the Peronismo in 2003, or the water war in Bolivia in 2000 against the privatization of the water, and the development of the Movimiento al Socialismo, socialist movement led by Evo Morales. But you have in 2001 for example, the creation of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a first important institution of Eurasia between Russia and China, that is a relation to create a new multipolar world against unipolar world centered in Washington. Since 2001, you have a reaction of part of the elites or dominant groups and part of the popular classes in the periphery and the semi-periphery. And you have, or this movement is expressed in the governments and in the states. And the dominant power groups in the United States cannot accommodate the new distribution of world power. And the policies to avoid relative decline end up deepening it. And this is an important point too. And obviously, the war and the financialization is a response of the crisis of hegemony, but this response produced the contrary effect, a boomerang. Since 2008 and 2009, you have the Great War Economic Crisis. We can observe 4 important contradictions since 2008. First, between the stagnation of the global north and against the extraordinary growth of China and much of the Indo-Pacific region. The second important contradiction is between neoliberal capitalism in crisis, which is deepening in financialization process, in face to the dynamic of productive development of the model called market socialism in China, for example, and other development models in other semi-peripheral countries. Third, you have a contradiction between global north, G7, for example, and the NATO, and the emerging powers of the semi-periphery countries articulated in the BRICS. Obviously, within each BRICS state, you have a contradiction against or between different strategic political projects. You can see that in Brazil between Lula and Bolsonaro politics. But in the semi-periphery countries, you have this process against global north that is expressed in a BRICS, in the BRICS. And you have a contradiction since 1998 between the global north monopoly on advanced technology, world trade and finance, and the breaking of these monopolies by China and, to a lesser extent, other semi-periphery countries. Furthermore, due to the scale and characteristics of China, this implies a systemic challenge to the center semi-periphery organization of the modern world system, and in particular contemporary post for this form. And this is an important point to a Arrighi perspective, that it's very important to understand the actual dynamics. Since 2014, take the perspective of Arrighi and Silver, I say we have the start of the hybrid and fragmented world war. it's a concept different of Cold War, a new Cold War. But this hybrid and fragmented World War have a similar questions or similar element with the Cold War, but it's very different because the war and the system challenge is different. And in this new moment, we have the contradiction between the global unipolar multilateralism and the institution of the old world order built under the US hegemony, and on the other hand, the multipolar multilateralism, a new institution that expresses a new map of world power. So between a contradiction between unipolar multilateralism and multipolar multilateralism, like, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or regional institutions in Latin America, like the Community of Latin American States, or the Union of South American States, different institutions. Second, the breaking of the strategic supremacy of the United States and NATO in the face of the growing capacity of China, Russia, and other actors to confront the aggressive behavior of United States and the NATO. You can see that in Syria or Afghanistan or Ukraine or well. In addition, the strategic features between the all allies are key, the all allies of United States. The contradictions into the global north. And you have an important contradiction since 2014 between neoliberal globalization and the emergence of globalization with Chinese characteristics or BRICS characteristics. Well, other important moment in the perspective of Arrighi and Silver is in relation to the domination without hegemony. It's the triumph of anti-globalism at the core of the all world power, the triumph of the Brexit and especially Trump. The political triumph obtained by the anti-globalist forces in the United States and the United Kingdom meant a qualitative leap in the fracture of the so-called establishment power groups and ruling classes in the all core of world power. It indicates the reaction of a group of actors, of a group of power that found themselves threatened or harmed in the process of globalization. And this is an important question. We can establish some relation with the process, with the similar process of United Kingdom at the beginning of the 20th century. The anti-globalist reaction sharpens as the relative decline of the United States progresses on the map of world power, and the relative economic stagnation, along with technological progress and production relocalization, stir up the struggles between capitalists and strike important categories of workers. And to finish, the pandemic it was an important point to accelerating trends in the transition of world power. And we can see 6 tendencies in relation to the presentation of Beverly. First, the rise of Asia, Indo-Pacific, and China in particular, and the relative decline of the West, and specifically US. And the problem because the political or the strategies to avoid this decline, it's a boomerang, deepen the decline, so, or produce more negative consequences or sharp the decline. Second, the second tendency is growing political strategic contradiction between dominant groups and between classes around the distribution or democratization of power and world wealth. I say this growing political strategic contradiction is between into the dominant groups, into the dominant group of the center and the dominant groups of the periphery and semi-periphery, and obviously between dominant groups and popular classes or subordinated groups. The third trend is the crisis of the world power and multilateral institutions and their legitimacy. A new multilateralism, a multipolar multilateralism. For the structural economic crisis and the crisis of neoliberal financial capitalism and the so-called globalization. 5, the transformation in the relation of production in relation with a new technological paradigm, the so-called 4th Industrial Revolution. And we can see in China a new development model based on the combination of mode of production called market socialism, that is that have the capacity to develop this 4th industrial revolution in a path without accumulation by dispossession. But well, it's a discussion. And 6, and this is very important, there is the process in peripheral and semi-peripheral countries that exacerbate national struggles and geopolitical disputes. We have in this process, this transition between revolution and counter-revolutions process. In Latin America, this is clear. The right wings political sector, or in the right wings, emerge anti-liberal reaction, ultra-conservative, but at the same time ultra or super neoliberalism. So combine an anti-liberal conservative reaction and neoliberal model. And on the other hand, you have a new wave of social protests and progressive governments and national popular politics and process. Well, sorry for my English. I am working about that, but well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much. 谢谢.
Thank you, Gabriel. I think you mentioned something very important, especially the framework, because you mentioned the Wallerstein's the word system theory, and when we are discussing, so we cannot just discuss, when it comes to the global south, so we know that it has developed this decline in the world system, and we might be able to read outside, not just what Professor Silver just mentioned. We have to also consider the global south because they are also in the periphery or the semi-periphery, because when the globalization is disintegrating, they are suffering from the cost that is transferring out from the global north, and also they have to suffer all the conflicts in the domestic conflicts that is transferred from the global south too, plus all the debt crisis, because the debt is from the global north. And the global south has to suffer domestically, internally, these social conflicts. So all of this has to be discussed in the globalization and the crisis of globalization, so that everybody can understand it as an objective law. So thank you for your comments, Gabriel MERINO, because you have made a very good complimentary comments. And we would like to know, we will have to bring into light that in the global in the capitalism crisis that started by the America, because especially in the 2008 Wall Street economic crisis, when Americans started the QE policies and started to aiding the liquidity of US dollar in the internet global markets, which caused the inflation in the developing countries. And they even allowed these allies, the West Europe and Japan, to also issuing more currencies, which means the core countries, the core of the financial capitalism, they are producing the global inflation. But in this process, we also noticed that there is a new core of crisis which is emerging, or maybe it's already formed its shape, which is in 2013, America started 6 financial organization within the framework of G7. But also they aid the Switzerland. Switzerland is a very important financial economy in the West. So the EU plus Japan, Canada, UK, and Switzerland, all these important Western financial economies, they started a exchange compacts, which means none of them will suffer from the economic crisis, because when whoever is suffering from a deficit of the currency, the other countries can immediately give them the liquidity and also at a very low interest rate, which means they can transfer out the crisis without suffering from it internally. And we call this the new core of the world. And the periphery, what about those countries who are subject to these countries, to the core, become the semi-periphery. Whoever resists the inflation, whoever dare to stand out, becomes the outsiders. So as you can see, that is putting sanctions to China, Iran, Venezuela, etc. All of these countries become this world system that is led by the global financial capitalism. All of these countries become the outsides. But we have the India. India is the semi-periphery. But India doesn't enjoy trade surplus and also have a higher deficit in its finance. So as a semi-periphery, it doesn't enjoy the aid from the core countries, because they are only the core countries are going to just going to maintain its own leadership. The other countries, the periphery, the semi-periphery, are becoming the objects of attacks. So as we can see, these countries, they just they started form this kind of currency exchange peg. It's just a process of the financial capitalism. So I would like to see that the forum of especially this session with the framework that Professor Silver just proposed, plus the developing countries' process of being subject to the core and also suffering from all the crises. I would like to see all of this can be combined together and to form a framework about the analysis of the world crisis, so that we can have a better view, a better discuss on the current situation. So thank you. Thank you, Professor MERINO. So now we are going to invite Ravi, Professor Ravi PALAT. We would like to hear his comment. And Ravi PALAT is a professor of sociology at Binghamton University, the State University of New York at Binghamton, and had previously taught Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and Sociology at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. He is author of Capitalist Restructuring and the Pacific Rim and the Making of an Indian Ocean World Economy, plus the book that is titled Princess, Petty Fields, and Bazaars. So now welcome, Professor PALAT.
Thank you for inviting me for this, and I really enjoyed Beverly Silver's paper. I really like the transition from a legitimate protector to a racketeer as a framework to look at the decline of US hegemony. I wanted to explore a bit about the transition and then talk a little more about the war in Ukraine and US policies there, because I think that will ultimately further undermine the US position, because apart from the US as a legitimate protector having an economic aspect and a military aspect, its control over international payments. What Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in 1972, when he was finance minister of France, said that the US has an extraordinary privilege because the dollar is the international means of currency. I think the war in the Ukraine and the weaponizing of finance is also going to have a blowback. I think also that I want to start a bit with the 1980s, when the US entered the market for international currency debt, borrowing from the international currency markets, and siphoned off the money from Latin America, Eastern Europe, and other countries, heralded what was called the lost decade for Latin America. The shift, as Phil McMichael has said, from the development project to the new liberal globalization project, also extracted resources from the third world, from indebted countries in the third world, especially Latin America, and it also it helped actually the European elite. It led to Thatcherism, and it transformed it transformed European politics to a certain extent. That Labour Party in
Excuse
England.
me, Professor Ravi,
Yeah?
please speak slowly.
Okay, let me start
Thank you.
again. Okay, what I wanted to say was that the US power as a legitimate protector depended not only on the economic framework it provided for its allies and the military protection it gave its allies, but also its control over the international monetary payment system. That the dollar was the currency of international payments. And that, I think, is now coming under threat with the war in Ukraine, when the US has weaponized finances by confiscating the assets of Russian oligarchs, the Russian banks, etc. And I want to come back to that. I want to come back to that, but I want to start with the 1980s, when the US entered the market for international loans to tamp down its inflation rate. And this led to money flowing to the US rather than to the so-called newly industrializing countries in Latin America, Eastern Europe, elsewhere. So this led to these countries being subject to structural adjustment by the IMF and the World Bank. And both the United States and European allies benefited from this. At the same time, it shifted the politics of Europe from, especially away from the left. Mitterrand, who was elected as the socialist president of France, implemented austerity politics. Tony Blair, who succeeded Margaret Thatcher, was her heir in Allston. And this eventually, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it split European politics. The Gaullists and the Social Democrats in France are a shadow of their former selves. The Italian divisions between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats have fallen by the wayside. And it has, in a sense, enabled the rise of far-right parties everywhere. You have Marine Le Pen now having 2.7 million votes more than she had in the last election. You have the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany becoming a strong party. You have Viktor Orban in Hungary. You have the Law and Justice Party in Poland. Then, of course, you have Bolsonaro, you have the alliance between Duterte and Marcos clans in the Philippines. You have Modi in India. You have the far right coming. But it also meant that there was one of the problems, it also allowed Reagan to ramp up military expenditure and eventually defeat the Russians in the second Cold War of the 1980s. But the US faced a problem in incorporating Russia as a junior ally in its new ruling bloc. Unlike the fact that the US had incorporated Britain as a junior ally in its hegemonic bloc, because Russia was too big to do that. It could not be integrated into Europe because it is too big. And this was a problem which, this is, I think, part of the problem Biden faces. And on the one hand, NATO basically had lost its reason for existence. There was really no threat coming to NATO. And in fact, NATO had been becoming an aggressor. It had gone into the Balkan wars with Serbia. It had pushed the US into the war with Libya, and it had offered to go into Afghanistan. And then it saw that the US treated it very badly, that the US withdrew from Afghanistan without consulting or even informing its NATO allies. The US decided to have a pact with Australia and the United Kingdom, which led to Australia canceling our submarine orders with France. So, and it is certainly clear that after the Russian army suffered such serious problems initially in attacking Ukraine, that Russia is not likely to march into NATO lands, that it cannot afford to fight NATO. So in this sense, the US is trying to create a fear among NATO, to create NATO as a bulwark. And in this sense, what is interesting is that there has been complete cooperation with the European elite. The papers in the Anglosphere, the Guardian, the Financial Times, apart from the papers in the US, none of them are opposed to the US strategy in the war. Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party in England, has threatened to expel any member of the parliament, or Labour member of parliament, who will join the anti-war movement. There is no US anti-war movement against Ukraine. So you have, but this unity is fragile. Because on the one hand, the US has weaponized finance. It has initially, as Beverly Silver and Payne argued, confiscated assets from the Afghan central bank, but it has also confiscated assets of the Russian oligarchs and the Russian banks. The oligarchs had, in fact, parked their money assets in Europe and the United States to shield them from confiscation by autocrats in Moscow and elsewhere. So this has meant that increasingly that other powers, China, India, other powers, are looking for ways to avoid the dollar, creating new mechanisms for payment for Russian oil or international trade. So this undermines the strength eventually of the dollar. That this has been one of the most important blowbacks of the Ukraine war. A second blowback has been that there has been no provision by the United States, no forethought about the cost of increased food prices coming because of the loss of Ukrainian Russian food. And this has been one of the reasons why the third world, most of the global south, has not joined in the sanctions regime. The US somehow, what Beverly said, is a cultural attachment to being number one. When it goes to Venezuela, when it has not recognized the Venezuelan president Maduro as the legitimate president, and asked Venezuela to supply, to make up for the Russian oil. Right? I mean, it asked China, who it identifies as a strategic enemy, to support it against Russia. I mean, where is this logic coming from? Right? So this seems to me a real problem, and the fact that new supply lines for Russian oil through Iran and Iraq are now coming to India. At the same time, in Sri Lanka, Victoria Nuland, who had been the US secretary, who had instigated the coup in Ukraine in 2014, coming to Sri Lanka, and some of Sri Lankan authorities claim that there has been US interference in the Sri Lankan internal politics, which, as you know, is now exploding. So you have not only the economic pillar, the military aspect, but also the US control over international payments is now being undermined. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Ravi. Now we are indeed facing multiple challenges. The international situation is extremely complex, and Professor Ravi talked about the different contradictions happening around the world in different regions, especially the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and their influence on different countries in the world. He made analysis of this. From his analysis, we understand that during the process of the collapsing globalization, there will be multiple conflicts and struggles and contradictions, and even they may break out intensively at the same time. So no matter what kind of analysis we're making now, we cannot follow this ever-changing situation. So our forum comes in a very timely manner, and all the inputs were very useful. And then now we will open to receive questions. We would like to ask the staff of the session if we're prepared for questions. Now I'm receiving a list. The one who raised the question is named Wang Xin. For Professor Silver, you just mentioned that you should remove the fuel from the barrel, like where there needs to be some systemic revolution, like the ecological civilization in China. As for the US or other North countries, is there factors for changing the system? Are there any good way out, good direction? And then the second one is also for Professor Silver. Then we want to have an answer from Professor Beverly Silver. Thank you.
I guess the first question is in terms of the way out for the US and the global North. And when I talked about the proposal for ecological civilization, I don't understand that as a proposal just for China. I understand that as more of a global proposal, is something, I mean, to be not to be imposed uniformly everywhere, but that there's a certain elements of it that provide a principles for organization of human society, and that has to do, with respect for livelihood and dignity for people, and for respect for the environment and the ecology, however, what's true is that everywhere, that history matters, geography matters, different places have different foundations on which to build. So, you know, I mean, the organizational foundation, obviously there's not a strong rural peasant society basis to build on within the United States or even within Europe at this point. So it would have to have some different form. But let me just comment, you know, quickly, because I think this relates to the idea that the, you know, this proposal of having a group on to analyze the crisis. I think this is an excellent idea because it's both a global crisis, but a crisis that looks differently depending on where you're situated. So having differently, it's a crisis that looks differently depending on geographically where you're situated, and also dependent on how the angle of vision thematically at which you look at the crisis. So I think that this is something that takes a global and comparative perspective on the crisis is an important project. Then what is the goal of these theoretical tools? It seems to me that the purpose of the theoretical tools are to provide a way of looking at the problem for, you know, either for movements or for those in power or for regular people about living life. It's a kind of when you look at this big macro change, it's a kind of weather forecast. But the problem is, and this is a question I don't know the answer to, is whether the US politicians, that their problem is that they don't have the theoretical tools, or they don't want to listen to reality. They would rather live in this kind of fantasy world. What Ravi was saying, it was, where is this logic coming from? You know, it's like that they want to operate in a situation. But maybe, I don't know, I had some comments on the other comments, but maybe I should hear the other questions if there are more questions, and then I can also maybe respond to some of the discussing comments in the context of what other questions come up.
Okay, so now the next question is from a student called Chen Zhida. So his question is also for Professor Beverly Silver. It says, in order to deal with future crises, besides strong organizations, there is also a need to unify the interests of different peoples and countries. So China has proposed to build a community of shared future for mankind, a harmony in diversity, seeking common ground while resolving the differences. So what do you think about this this idea of a community of shared future for mankind?
I mean, I think it's essential that there be some kind of a development of a conception of a shared future for mankind. You know, I think one thing that Professor Muto Ichio spoke about on the first day, which I thought was very important, and I want to repeat it, was this decision not to fight each other, that people should refuse to fight each other. His vision of, you know, war is a crime, and people should not go along with the crimes of their you know, of those who want to involve them in their crimes. So I think that that's, you know, like an absolute fundamental is to find some form of anti-war pro-peace internationalism that, again, where we know, like I know in the United States, for example, there's going to be increasing pressures, movements, efforts to create a cross-class nationalist defense of the United States world power with, with very little understanding of the complexity of the nature of the crisis. So I think that the discussants have talked about many different elements of complexity of the crisis that's being faced, and it cannot just be, kind of dig in one's heels and hold on to the status of number one. And I think some of the tools, that, the US was in a deep crisis in the 1970s, right? After the defeat in the war in Vietnam, there was also a period of high inflation, and that crisis was resolved through Reagan and Thatcher launching the new Cold War, second Cold War, so increasing militarism, an austerity campaign, attacks on the welfare state, on labor, on the structural adjustment, the shifting of the debt crisis from the United States to the third world. So this series of debt crises in Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe. And if you think about today, there seems to be efforts to follow a similar playbook to dealing with the crisis today as the crisis of the 70s, but it can't work. Because if the US was raising interest rates in a context where it didn't have a large external debt, but if the US raising the interest rates now, either you default on the external debt because you're raising the interest rate, you're the biggest debtor, right? And you're raising the interest rates on yourself, or you're creating yet another element of instability. You're not moving out of the crisis towards stability, even for the United States, you're moving into further difficulty and instability. So, which then gets us back to the potential, again, where all these things end up intertwined, the debt crisis, the geopolitical crisis, the social political crisis within the country. I agree also with what Ravi PALAT brought up about the war in Ukraine. Again, it looks like it's a solution in the sense that suddenly NATO is relevant and suddenly the United States power is relevant to Europe, to Western Europeans, right? And some Eastern, but anyway, but it's creating the blowback, as he puts it, in terms of this weaponization. I mean, there's been a weaponization of US banks and the dollar and access to the dollar and whatever. But, this has been taken to a new extreme and is going to definitely, I agree, it's going to undermine the capacity of the centrality of the dollar, because at this point, it's you can just look around the sanctions with the exclusion from SWIFT, all these things. So, the dollar has managed to hang on you know, for decades beyond when it should realistically have, you know, had such a strength and role. And right now, as I'm talking, the dollar is going up, you know, in really, so, but I think that, you know, there's that, that, you know, again, I think that we will look back in another, I don't know how many years, but see this as a turning point in terms of also the dollar underpinnings of US power. The other thing, well, I wanted to just speak to this question of the right wing, you know, and the rise of populism, because the chart that I showed earlier, it includes, you know, strikes by workers, it includes peace movements, it includes, you know, all sorts of movements for equality, but it also includes, you know, far right and fascist mobilizations. And if we just pull out the far right and fascist mobilizations, we see two periods over the last 150 years where there's a major peak of far right and fascist mobilizations. And one is in the 1930s and the other is today. And this is, again, very tied to the fact that the old left of the 20th century in Europe, in the United States, has ended up buying into the politics of austerity and not offering an alternative other than neoliberalism to its population. And so it opened up the space for the far right. The same thing happened in the 1920s. It's very interesting. In the 1920s, in Europe, after the First World War, there was a fixation on getting back on the gold standard. And all these labor governments, socialist governments that were democratically elected in Europe in the 1920s pursued a policy of austerity, and the left alternative was discredited, and people didn't vote for austerity, so that also democracy in terms of elections democratic elections was also discredited in the 1920s, and it was part of what opened the path to the rise of fascism and to further militarism, imperialism, and a Second World War. So watching what's been happening with the left, meaning these old socialist parties and labor parties, investing in austerity as with a fixation on the stability of the euro, has also opened up again this rise space for right-wing parties to emerge, for fascist movements to emerge, for the sense that there's no peaceful, non-militaristic path forward. No, they're not even, talking about something that would be a Western parallel to the ecological civilization. Again, it's very marginal and whatever. So it doesn't mean things are going to stay this way, because I think that the more it's clear that the path that the United States and that the West in general is following is a dead end, literally dead end, that I think that there will be more openness to hearing alternative critiques. But I think that, that the point has to be gotten where, even the most stubborn kind of US imperialist nationalists can see that this path is like it's a choice between blowing up the entire world or taking another path. So that's more or less where it's like some people like to use the socialism or barbarism, but anyway, it's a choice really not even between that. It's really between blowing up the world and choosing an alternative path. So I think that, what we have to be is ready, constantly saying there is another path. There is an alternative, that this is not the only path, that the one that's being pursued is not the only one. And the one that's being pursued is a path to disaster for everybody.
Thank you, Professor Silva. Thank you for your answers. And I have seen that in the Zoom chat room. And there is Professor Zhou and Professor Huang Ping. They both of them also have lots of thoughts and research on the topics of the global issues. I would like to invite them to share some of their thoughts with us. Are you here, Professor Zhou?
There's so much which has been covered and much which can be said. Personally, the most problematic issue for me is the analysis of how the financial system interacts with everything else today. And this is a subject which I don't think the US is particularly bothered about having to pay back its debt to anybody. It has been borrowing for 60 years. And it's a major source of international liquidity. So that, I think, as Ravi pointed out, the French finance minister speaking half a century ago was quite right in talking about exorbitant privilege, which then underscores the importance of US hegemony. Because the essence of hegemony is not just the outright domination, but the acceptance of that domination and the willingness to pay for it by basically continuing to fund the US. And this happens with a lot of the Gulf countries, which have been the other major source of purchase of US Treasury bonds. And of course, Japan, as was correctly pointed out. China did so from the late 20th century for a variety of reasons, and now finds itself in a situation of having accumulated a great deal of US Treasury bonds, which gives it some bargaining power, but it's not a bargaining power which it can be used significantly. I think, as has been correctly pointed out in previous discussions as well as today, there is a new challenge, and that is the breakdown of the system, partly due to miscalculations on the part of the government of the day in the US. And particularly, I'm thinking about some of the sanctions measures and the breaking up of the SWIFT system and other kinds of payment system, which is forcing Russia and others, including China, to develop their own payment system. Now, if the rest of the world sees some advantage in diversifying their assets, this basically will slowly, not overnight, will slowly undermine the US financial hegemony. But we are not talking about a situation which is going to change overnight. And the US right now probably has more allies than ever than before because of its success in turning in using the situation to its advantage. But so I think that's a crucial point. Some of the other issues I have to do with more long-standing questions about the utility of world systems perspective, which how do we understand, how does it explain, for example, Brazil and the differences between a Lula government and so on. So I think there are many other issues which could be debated, but I think the challenge which Beverly puts for us is really the contradictions of the present moment and the dangers of the present moment. Personally, I'm less negative than she is about populism, because I think the only real challenges in the world today are essentially populist challenges of various types. So you have the right-wing populisms of various types, but you also have the potential for a progressive nationalist populisms. And this, I think, is what you see, for example, with the Colombian, with the election of Gustavo Petro, which is where he talks very openly about building capitalism in Colombia. He's not trying to build socialism. And this, I think, is a very, very interesting kind of phenomenon. And other kinds of conversations which are taking place so far, mainly in South America, but I suspect some of these discussions may go beyond. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
So Beverly, after listening to your presentation and excellent talks, I have one question, just one, amongst many others. I shared almost all of your points. One thing you actually have not mentioned, either because of the time or whatever the reasons, that is something here in China or even Eastern Asia and some other countries, emerging economies, nowadays emphasized so much. That is so-called scientific technological innovations and its implications. May this kind of so-called innovations help or slow down at least the crisis of this nowadays US-led but kind of capitalist domination of the capitalist system for the last several hundred years. For instance, I just got a few hours ago from a website. It's called MIT Scientists Think. They have discovered, this is the topic, how to fully reverse climate change. So this was something, do you think this may actually help or slow down instead of either going to the war or those sort of possible consequences or immediate consequences you have mentioned, populism, economic financial collapse, war, all of those. So this is the question I have had.
Thank you, Jomo and Huangping, for those questions and comments, and also to all the others for their questions and comments. Let me start with the scientific technical innovations. So no doubt, I think there'll be important scientific and technological innovations that will deal with various aspects of the crisis. The problem is two things. One is, will be obviously the control of these innovations. So, we have the example of the way in which vaccine was distributed or not distributed, and became basically a lot of the problems with the pandemic response has been related to the capture of profit motive for the distribution of vaccines, particularly those developed in the West. And then, so that could, again, so case by case in terms of the scientific technological innovations. Another interesting thing, which I hate to keep coming back to war, but if you look over the course of the certainly last several centuries, William McNeill has an interesting book called The Pursuit of Power. He wrote it published in 1984, but where, he, among other things, he's showing the role of military and geopolitical conflict in pushing both financing and pushing innovation, which then may or may not get deployed in peaceful ways. The problem is that the scientific, and I think I've already said this, but let me put it a different way, that the scientific technological innovations in themselves are not going to resolve the crisis. They may help, but only if they're brought into a different logic than the capitalist logic, and the different and a power logic, and they're brought into under their use and diffusion are brought under some form of a livelihood logic, a protection of livelihood and a protection of ecology logic. So I know, so that's what I mean, but there's a lot, it's a big conversation. And Joma, I think I agree. I know that the dollar has been defying the laws of gravity for a long time, and that that there's that's obituary, there's the danger of writing the obituary too soon. At the same time, there's the danger of ignoring all of these things that are these limits, contradictions that are building up in the system, and including what you mentioned about the SWIFT, or what, or the fact that it's, putting savings in US banks for anybody who thinks they might end up on the wrong side of US geopolitical conflict, is increasingly dangerous. So I think there, again, that I'm not putting a date, but I just, I think that the US world power, it had a beginning, it has a middle, it's going to have an end. The end is approaching. And in terms of the last thing, I'm not. I don't know. I think people took me maybe as I think that in terms of I purposely stopped for a minute to talk about why these popular movements and social movements are good, because the nature of what I was going to be talking about this vicious circle between domestic and international conflict, and so like wars and revolutions and that can make it look like, okay, let's avoid like popular mobilization from below. And I wasn't actually trying to say that. And I think that what I'm trying to say is that the problem we have is not the popular mobilizations, and even probably not to some extent, because even the right-wing popular mobilizations are sending us a signal. They're sending a signal to us about what are the problems? What are the problems that people are feeling about in their daily life? And so but the issue is that there's no, the response, right, has been, there needs to be a sort of a new form of social protection that is able to respond to these kind of challenges from below, right? So, yeah. And I think that it's very important to watch these movements, including populist movements, in terms of what they say about what kind of a demand there is from below for a different kind of society. They're showing that there's a demand from below for something different. And we've got a different paper actually where we look at the demands that are coming up from all these movements and say what that points to in terms of what we need to think about as the solution to the crisis that we're in. You know, so I'll leave it there, but I'm not 100% pessimistic. Yeah, just concerned.
Thank you, Professor Silver, for her response. And among our participants, there is also Professor Mahandi from India. He also raised a question. I would like Professor Mahandi to turn on the camera and mic and join us directly. Please, Professor Mahandi.
No, it was a great discussion again, great lecture. My question is, I think there is a globalization of capitalism per se. And therefore, even though US decline may be terminal, should we take it as capitalism's terminal decline? Because we have seen the UK experience, and now we are seeing the US experience. But in the process, and I think Wang Ping's point is very important, you know, science, technology, innovation, plus the financial management together, plus the new technique of surveillance and manipulation and control. All this have given new weapons to capitalism in global scale. And what is worse, most emerging major economies are relying on capitalist processes, institutions, and various mechanisms. Therefore, Asian capitalism also acquiring new modes of management to handle the legitimacy crisis? So that was my question.
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. And I think also the very way you ended, whether it was tools to handle the legitimacy crisis, they're tools of repression, mostly what you're mentioning, right? Tools of surveillance and repression, but not tools of consent so much, maybe some, but not so much, I think, particularly. So then I think the question becomes, it's this old question about to what extent and for how long can those in power rule primarily through coercion as opposed to consent. And so, I tend to be of the school that pure coercion or predominantly coercion is an extremely unstable form of rule, that it doesn't, So I think there's limits there too. It's just, I think the problem, it potentially can lengthen the time that this very dysfunctional and deadly system can hold on and remain. But it also means that, we'll have I think that at least we are trying to do is avoid a long period of deep kind of collapse and systemic chaos and suffering. Anyway, let me leave it there.
Thank you.